welcome to Writer, a show for writers about writers. I'm Carol Grimes, your host, and with me is our guest for today, Scott Morris. Hi, Scott.
Hello.
And welcome.
Thank you.
Scott, I have to ask you, where did you get the ideas for these characters? Did you think them all up? They seem very realistic in a way, but they are really fascinating. Where did they come from?
Thank you. There are a lot of writers who are very autobiographical, and you can almost do a one-to-one correspondence with the plot points of their life, the writers' lives, and their relationships, and the plot points in their fiction, and the relationships in the fiction. And there are other writers who, by the time they get some inspiration from whatever life experiences they have had, and it ends up on the printed page, it's transmogrified so much so you can't do that. And I'm of the latter camp. But I did have sort of a personal story that led to the writing of this book. My father grew up in Dothan, Alabama, and he had a favorite aunt, and she loved him very much, and he was her favorite nephew. And when he was 16 years old, she had to be committed because her husband, unbeknownst to the family, had been very physically abusive to her, and she had slowly, before they realized it, come to lose her hold on reality. Sadly, she had to be committed, and she broke out of whatever institution she was in, and she called home, and my father happened to answer the telephone. And as I say, he was just 16 years old, so he was just a boy. And he revered this woman, and she said, "Max, I have managed to get out of this awful place that I'm in." And she told him where she was, and she said, "Could you please come and get me?" And so he told her that he would. And when he hung the telephone up, he realized that he was in an awful dilemma, because all of us, rightly so, don't want to suppose that anyone is not really responsible for their actions. So he had that, and he also loved this woman so much, and he had also been given this trust with her on the telephone. So he debated what to do, and reluctantly, he decided that he would tell my grandmother, his mother. And so they allowed him to show up at the gas station where she had made the phone call. And he drove in a car by himself, and he showed up first. But my grandmother and some people from the institution were right behind him. And when he walked over to my aunt, she saw that my grandmother was behind him and the people from the institution. And she looked at him and she said, "Max, you've betrayed me." And he said that he really never got over it, even though he had made the right decision. And there's a happy ending to that story. Everyone always asks, well, what happened to the aunt? She ended up going out to California, remarrying, and having a family, and ended up with a wonderful life. But that was sort of the emotional spark that set this story in motion. And even though the story itself has really nothing to do with that, it's similar to when one of my great heroes in literature is Vladimir Nabokov, and he was asked once, "What is your inspiration for Lolita?" And he said that when he was in Paris, he read about a chimpanzee that they were trying to teach how to do sign language, and the first message that the chimpanzee signed was, "I'd like to get out of this cage." And so he said that was the spark that led to Lolita, which is about imprisonment, but it's not about a chimpanzee in a cage. So like there's no literal one-to-one correspondence, but that was the emotional spark that set me in motion.
Yes, that does, because the reader is so painfully aware of Roy's being caught among all those forces. His mother, Leonard, April, the community, his dead father, and somehow the haunting of that father and the father's relationship with April too has put him in such an untenable position.
Right.
So, yeah, that's fascinating. I wondered also about Roy's father, Sanders Royce Collier.
Right.
Did you know what kind of person he was going to be when you started the story out with him? Did you already have his character developed in your head, or did he kind of evolve as you put the story together?
I generally knew what he was all about because he's so integral to the plot. What did change is that I began to humanize him and flesh him out. In earlier drafts of this book, he was strictly sinister. And in the version that has been published, I would like to believe that has some sinister aspects. He's a questionable character, but you can also sort of understand what he was trying to do, and that he had some lofty goals and aspirations, although he fell far short of them. So that did change. But I generally knew the kind of person that he needed to be to get this story off the ground, to haunt the story, which is what he does.
Yes, he certainly does. And I think his influence on all the characters is primarily sinister and almost kind of magical in a demon sort of way. And there are other references to demons with different characters in here. I don't want to pigeonhole the story or the book, make it stereotyped, but it has so many elements of Southern Gothic. When I got into it, I started thinking of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, the wonderful, luscious, fragrant South that you evoke so successfully in this. And then these characters that are all a little extreme, some very extreme, but on the average they are extreme types. And then how that creates such a compelling story and such a strong sense of the magic of place.
Right.
Do you feel that the South has a certain magic that other regions of the country don't quite have? Or?
Well, I do believe that the South is distinct. And the truth is that my knowledge of other regions in the country isn't sufficient for me to make any sort of a comprehensive statement. But I know enough to know that you will, for instance, you will hear people say that the South anymore isn't any different from New Jersey. We are becoming more homogenized as a nation, but you don't have to spend too much time in the South to realize you're in a very different sort of place. And there are people who love that, and there are people who don't like it. So whether you're a fan of Southern ways or you are someone who is not a fan of Southern ways, you recognize that there are Southern ways of doing things. And I think most people who spend any time in the South pick up on that. The fact that we have suburbs is not really apropos as far as I'm concerned. The question is, what are the people like in those suburbs? So there's definitely still an identity of the South, and I tried to capture some of that in this book. And one thing about this book that I was aware of and mindful of is that C. Vann Woodward wrote a famous essay about Southern literature. He was a great historian, and he was trying to delineate the differences between Southern literature and literature in the rest of the country, and he made a fascinating statement that had the benefit of being true as well. He said that you can't imagine a grandfather in a Hemingway novel, and that the prototypical American story is of self-made people who sort of spring into existence ex nihilo, trailing no chains of history behind them. Now, the Southern writer has a radically different approach. The Southern writer is painfully aware or blissfully aware, depending on the story and your take, of how burdened we are with history or of how much we owe to those who have come before us. And this story is one that has everything to do with what has happened before the narrator comes onto the scene, before Roy comes onto the scene. In fact, in the first chapter, he says that he felt like that when he was growing up, he had been dealt a hand of cards that he was not permitted to examine, but he had to play the game anyway. And so the difficulty was for him to figure out, well, what is this hand of cards that I've been given, so I can play it as best I can.
Yes, that was a fascinating image to use, and I thought about that image all the way through and how he is trying to see what is in those cards and play them as best he can, and they're so painfully, slowly revealed to him. Now, this takes place in Citrus, Florida,
That's right.
and you have some references to Jacksonville. What is your association with Florida? Why did you set it in Citrus, of all places?
I am a fourth-generation Floridian, so on my mother's side of the family, and her maiden name is Lanier. So
Okay.
I went ahead and took the linear name and used it. So we've been in Florida for a very long time, and in fact, my uncle, and I was just down on the farm yesterday, they live about an hour south of Orlando. The nearest town would be Wauchula, but it's just farmland that was homesteaded years ago, and they still do citrus and cattle there. And my cousins live on the property, and they are taking on with the farming, and I have one cousin who's a deputy sheriff there. But so Florida is more than just a place that I've lived, and it's even more than a place that I was born. I was born in Jacksonville, Florida, as a matter of fact. But I have a great deal of family history with Florida. And one thing that I found inspiring about doing this is you don't think of Florida as a place with any history at all. Much like California, Florida is a place that people escape to. They try to escape from their history to a place where they can sort of design a present for themselves and have a life of their own making. But for me, Florida is a place with a rich tradition, one that I adore, frankly. So I wanted to get some of that into the book as well. And it's also just, the story is also a tribute to, I think Florida is a very beautiful place physically. I grew up about 45 minutes from Orlando, and Windermere and Winter Garden are two little towns where I grew up. And I lived on a chain of lakes. There were 13 lakes. You could see the water was as clear as drinking water. And in the bottom of these lakes, a lot of it was white sand. And it was a truly magical place. I've described it. I live in Mississippi now, and I'll describe what it was like growing up. I used to get up in the morning, and I would spend all day going over these lakes, and I would just wander in the woods. There was no development. There was only 2 lakes that had any houses on them. The rest of the lakes were completely surrounded by woods. And I would fish all day long and swim and just go out into the middle of the lake and just jump off the boat and take my dog with me. And it was enchanted. It was like a fairy tale. And it sounded, when I begin to talk about it, I think a lot of people think that I'm pulling their leg because it sounds like a fairy tale, but in fact, that's the life that I had. That was my childhood. So part of this book is also just a real sense of gratitude on my part for the beauty that this state has, and a lament for the fact that so much of it sadly is being paved over with a lot of people think of Disney and they smile, but I'm afraid I frown because Disney World is really the reason that Central Florida has been paved over and really exploited. And what they paved over was some of the loveliest terrain that you could imagine. So it's a way. One thing that I like about writing is that you can invent things that don't exist, and you can reclaim things that no longer exist, but that you miss. But you can write them back into existence. So even though it's set in the Panhandle, it's really, part of it is reclaiming the lushness of Florida.
Well, I think you did that very successfully, and I was particularly grateful that you set this story in an area of Florida that outsiders don't think of. They think of Miami, they think of Orlando, the vacation lands, the beaches, but we who live here understand that the most beautiful parts are very different from that. As a matter of fact, Scott, I'd love for you to read one of the descriptions that captures that strong sense of place.
I'd be happy to. This is just by way of a quick setup. Roy is, as you know, head over heels for his aunt. And when he's a little boy, that's entirely endearing. And as he gets older, it gets a little bit more complicated. And so sometimes he gets into trouble, and he's a little bit goofy and adoring, as any young man will be in the presence of what I describe as a shockingly attractive young aunt. But he's an athlete as well, and a formidable football player. And when he gets into trouble, he'll go for these long runs when he's embarrassed himself somehow. And this is a scene where he's just a paragraph. He's been running, and he's finished his run. I had a favorite hilltop where I always finished my runs. It was in a pasture that belonged to Mr. Haney, stocked with gentle, white-faced cattle that never minded my intrusions. From there, as evening settled over citrus, I could see the lights of town and the water tank. I could see Sonic and Beachy Breeze's tanning salon and superstar celebrity video and the various stately churches and steeples. Farther on was the mall, which boasted a department store and 15 other outlets that to us seemed quite enough, and a lovely junkyard. And beside it, the quarters, where some of the dwellings were mere shanties, some quite respectable, and some with homegrown works of art decorating their yards, a pyramid of assembled tires, a standing cross made of painted hubcaps, even a dinosaur fashioned from scrap metal. In the other direction lay the rolling countryside and Lake Julep and an occasional farmhouse. Nothing that I saw was alien to me. I knew the owner of almost every house in Citrus, just as I knew the name of almost every tree that I saw, and almost every plant and flower. I knew each little creek and slough and pond and pasture. When it was windy, the silvery undersides of bay leaves roared up in rasping waves, and in the late spring and summer, lightning bugs sparked and careened in the twilight. The sunsets, especially in the warmer months, were thick as fruitcake, dripping like caramel, a swarming canvas of buzzing colors. An expert would point to the great humidity visited upon that part of the country, how the light refracts again and again through pale planets of water that catch flame and turn into a billion tiny, palpable prisms. But I say it is nothing less than the exalted exhalations of angels.
It's beautiful. And it's quite a tribute to this part of the country. I think you really capture that. And again, there's that magic. You know, to me, that was a very magical paragraph, and you feel so strongly his sense of magic in that place, the exhalation of angels. Wonderful. Scott, let's talk about your process of coming up with these ideas. We have a lot of writers and aspiring writers in our audience. How do you come up with these? How do you decide on the plot? How do you get this done? And then how do you balance that activity with the rest of your life?
Okay. There are two, generally speaking, there are two schools of thought on writing, particularly novel-length stories. One is that a story sort of grows organically. You discover the plot and you discover the dimensions of the characters as you go along. And there are famous advocates of that school. Walker Percy comes to mind. And then you have another camp, and these writers say that in fact you should be in complete command of a story from beginning to end before you start writing it. And I've already mentioned Vladimir Nabokov, and he is of that school, and he described his characters once as being galley slaves. So the truth of the matter is that they both work if you're a good writer, and you have to find out which approach works best for you. Or it may be the case that different stories dictate different approaches. I've written stories where I sort of felt my way along, and there's a great amount of joy in doing that. It's a discovery process that's very gratifying. But I've also gone into stories that I had really mastered the coordinates of before I began writing about the story in a serious way. April is a story that by the time I really turned to it, I had most of it well in hand. And it's a pretty complicated plot, so it was necessary for me to do that. And in order for me to make the most of the story, I needed to know exactly where I was going with it before I started it. But I don't think that there's a right or there's a wrong way. Flannery O'Connor said that you can do anything that you want in fiction so long as it works. I'm paraphrasing, but she said the problem is there's just not much that works. So, and then I heard another great comment. I was on a panel once with Barry Hannah, and I was a student of his, and there was another student of his there, a writer named Jerry Hoare, and he was describing Barry Hannah's genius for the short story, and it is nothing short of genius. He's a wonderful writer. And he said, you know, I've seen Barry, I've read some of his stories, and he's gotten bogged down. He's gotten into the weeds, but then he just puts wings to the story and flies it out, as only a genius can. So, you know, when you're supremely talented, you can do just about anything you want. But otherwise, there are some orthodox approaches, and they work well.
What advice would you give to someone who has an idea they might want to develop into a novel-length work, as far as managing the imaginative part and getting the actual work done? Maybe we have just a few minutes left, but help us on that score.
The first thing and the last thing to say about that is you have to want to tell that story no matter what the cost is. You have to want to tell that story even if there is no reward at the end of the day, other than the fact that you have produced, and for yourself alone, because it may not be published and no one else may agree with you, even if you get some friends to read it, that you have produced what Nabokov called, in this wonderfully memorable phrase, aesthetic bliss. And that is, you have made a story that aspires toward the condition of art, and it has that magic in it, at least for you. And if you believe you have a story that can generate that kind of commitment, that's when you should pursue it. And you write it. And it may take you a year, it may take you 5 years. This story took me about 6 years to finally get it the way that it needed to be. My first novel I wrote in 3 months. You don't know how long it's going to take. You don't know whether you're going to get published or not. You may get published and 50 copies may sell. You may win, the National Book Award, or it may never get published. But the great thing about writing for the pleasure of trying to achieve something artistically is that even if the book is written and it goes in a desk drawer and you pick it up every now and then and read it, you have the one satisfaction that you told your story. And that is a pure motivation for writing, and it's the only dependable motivation for writing. So a writer has to kind of have the combination of having a stoic sensibility, but then also has to be kind of Pentecostal when it comes to inspiration. You get excited even if you're alone and start raising your hands and shouting and for joy. So it's sort of an odd endeavor. But
well, that's helpful, and I think that again, with something that is well written like this, I think the reader can feel your joy of bringing these characters to life, giving life to this place, this very special place, and participating with the readers. I felt almost as if I were in a dialogue with Roy, who indirectly, I suppose, is you, right. And that really comes through. Speaking of dialogue, I want to ask you one more thing. We have a little bit of time left.
Okay.
How did you get this dialogue so exact? I can hear these voices. I've known these people. Do you really sit around and listen to a lot of different people? Do you take notes when you hear special things in dialogue?
Well, first of all, thank you, because it's always incredible to hear that. You nailed it, though, in the question. You said that you could hear those voices. Well, I can hear them, too. And I don't know how other writers go about it, and I've never really read a lot about, dialogue. But I know that for me, these characters have become so real that I can almost hear them, so it's almost like a form of dictation. Not what they're going to say. I'm a little bit more like Nabokov. They're going to say what I need them to say. But I can hear their voices, and it is a strange feeling. But that's how I try to impart some reality to it, is just to transcribe these voices that I'm hearing, and they're recognizable to me. And I know people that are similar, and the voices are distinct for that reason. Just as if you're paying attention and you're in a room with some of your friends, it doesn't all sound the same to you. So it's the same.
It certainly works. They are distinct and they are very Southern. Okay. So, done a great job with that. Thank you, Scott, for being with us. Thank you for being with us. Again, this is Writer to Writer. I'm Carol Grimes, and our guest today has been Scott Morris, author of Waiting for April.